Hello and welcome to Levels Plus Whenever episode 114, right off the heels of 113. We're going to talk about Dreamcast today, a little late, but I've recorded a top 25 Dreamcast game list, narrowing it down to a top 10. Which will probably be the case for a lot of the other consoles that are not the NES, or possibly the Switch. I've got a Switch list running, but I actually didn't play 100 games unless I get into like retro, like super retro stuff. And I'm still not quite there. I was a little surprised, actually. But for other consoles like the N64, Super Nintendo, PlayStation 1, 2, 3, 4, 5... I think a top 25 is probably going to be what I'm going to do for those, because I just don't have 100 games. And then I'd like to get into genre stuff eventually, but we'll cross that bridge eventually. Anyway, I do have some pickups that I'm going to stick in here from the future before this episode goes live. So future me, instead of past me for once, take it away. Alright, let's get some pickups together real quick before we jump into the main part of the video. I got some tech first. I finally bought headphones for all of those reaction videos that I do. So I can finally listen to the content. I'll have to figure out all of the finagling to make that happen, but I can now listen to headphones and record stuff, and you'll hear the regular audio. It's gonna be great. I also got brand new speakers for the computer, which are fantastic. They're Arena 3 speakers by SteelSeries, yeah, and they're great. Video game wise, I got the new Zelda, Echoes of Wisdom. I'll be playing that shortly. I also got the amiibo that comes with Link's Awakening, but seems important enough for Nintendo to re-release out of nowhere. And they actually had Peach at Best Buy. And you know, Peach has had a really good renaissance lately. So you can take Corrin's old spot, because Corrin's going away. Alright, we are here a little late for the Dreamcast anniversary. But, you know, a month late's not too bad. With all of the stuff going on in my life, honestly. So what I've done is I went through the Dreamcast library, and what is represented here is like 98% of what I've actually owned over the years. What's currently missing off of this list is Guilty Gear and NBA 2K1, probably. But I think I have captured everything else that I actually owned for the Dreamcast at one point or another. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take these 25 games and I'm going to figure out what my personal top 10 is. And we'll go from there. How I'm going to do this is I'm going to basically talk about influence on me as well as importance to the Dreamcast. So there might be a couple games that I personally wasn't as big on, but I think that represent the Dreamcast ideal, like the pinnacle of what that console was about. So I think the first thing to do is to eliminate some of the easy ones to cut out of the list. And I'm going to go ahead and start with Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. I don't necessarily think of that as a Dreamcast game. I think of that as a PS1 game that got ported to the Dreamcast. That was pretty easy. Third Strike, as important as it is to Street Fighter, I don't think the Dreamcast port is very well regarded in the FGC. in contrast to the other Capcom fighting games on the list. So I'm going to go ahead and take that off for now. I don't think the majority of people are going to think of Worms Armageddon as a Dreamcast game. They're going to think of it as a PC game that just happened to be on the Dreamcast. The two SNK games down here, Evolution and The Last Blade 2. I'm going to cut The Last Blade 2, even though that was like the port for a very long time for The Last Blade 2. I don't think people think of the Dreamcast as the best way to play The Last Blade 2. Here's a question. Sonic Adventure 2. Important game for the Dreamcast, but is it a better game on the GameCube? Where I think it actually took off. There's a part of me that wants to argue that Sonic Adventure 2, as important as it was for the Dreamcast, got a better version, and Sonic Adventure did not. The GameCube version of Sonic Adventure 1 is bad. So, I'm gonna take Sonic Adventure 2 off. Kind of surprised. Alright, well, we have eliminated the first round. Those were a lot of the ports and such that, in Sonic Adventure 2, that I don't think define the Dreamcast as much. So now we're going to get into a little bit more of a quality control type of situation here. And I got two extremely niche Capcom games currently on the list with Cannon Spike and Techromancer. I currently don't have either of these anymore. They're both good games, but they're not Capcom's best games. So I'm going to go ahead and take them out for now. I'm also going to take King of Fighters Evolution out, even though it is a special port that has some extra goodies and such in contrast to the Neo Geo original. I don't think people think of King of Fighters 99 when they think of the Dreamcast. They think of 98, and I never had that one. Calico vs. SNK is a very important Dreamcast game. I think. It was one of the last ones Capcom released. Project Justice was the last fighter that they released. But in contrast to the other games on this list that are from Capcom, I think it's the least impactful. As sad as that is to say when you cross over two titans of the fighting game genre. But it also got outclassed really quickly. There was Pro that came out on the PS1 that added characters. And then 2, which is one of the greatest fighting games of all time. As much as I love CBS 1 in terms of its aesthetic and its backgrounds and the crossover effect and its initial attempt to put these characters together, it's the weaker of the ones. And CBS 2 was on the Dreamcast in Japan. I'm not including it because I didn't play that one. I had the GameCube port. So I'm going to remove it. It makes me a little sad. Alright, we were almost down to 15. There's probably one at the top that is staring at you in the face as to why it's still on the list over some of the ones I've culled. I will argue till my dying breath that Sega Swirl is a defining Dreamcast game, and you can't convince me otherwise. But out of the 16 that are left, the one that I would probably cut to get us down to 15 is Choo Choo Rocket. As charming and adorable and really just Dreamcast as it is, I think out of the games that are still on this list, it's probably the weakest. We're getting into the really difficult selections now. Getting us down to a top 10 Dreamcast games. for me personally. So, reality check. Reality check time is in effect. What do I don't have now? I don't have Sonic Adventure. I don't have NFL 2K1. I don't have Jet Grind Radio. I don't have Crazy Taxi. I don't have the 2 Power Stones currently. I have everything else. But I feel all of those have importance on the whole to the Dreamcast legacy. So what I'm cutting here is basically getting down to my top 10, not so much influence, but I feel like these 15 games are very important to the overall legacy of the Dreamcast. So I want to preserve this little screenshot of these 15 games as pretty much very essential titles for the system. But to get down to my 10, NFL 2K1 is going to head out. I think I'm going to cut. Things are getting difficult. I love Project Justice. It is one of my top 111 games. But in terms of the port from the arcade to the Dreamcast, when you compare it to some of the others on this list, is a little lacking. Crazy Taxi is a spectacular port of an arcade game. Marvel 2 is a defining port. Power Stone is a defining port. We have freaking Soul Calibur down here. So, as much as I hate to kill Project Justice, it's still one of my favorite games, but I think it's one of the ones that has to get cut at this stage. Street Fighter Alpha 3, another one of my favorite games of all time. In fact, it is probably my third favorite Capcom fighting game, behind Street Fighter 6 and CBS 2. But is it a Dreamcast defining title? It's an important port. It's better than the PS1 port, but it is at least comparable to the Saturn port that we didn't get in North America. And then there's the PSP version that came out that added more characters and I think is considered definitive. So, as much as I love Alpha 3, and as much as I think it's one of the greatest fighting games of all time, in contrast to some of the others on this list, I don't think it's a defining Dreamcast game. And I think I'm just going to have to rip the Band-Aid on the game that I personally bought a Dreamcast for, but I would argue in the grand scheme of Dreamcast games that it is not a defining Dreamcast title in the way its sequel is, and that's Marvel vs. Capcom 1. I think this game is very important. I think this game means a lot to me personally. It's the one that taught me how to play Capcom fighting games. And I bought a Dreamcast for that port before Marvel vs. Capcom 2 was announced. But I don't think it has the same impact and legacy that MVC2 does, and there's some issues with the port with sound. Despite, Capcom doing a really good job on it, it doesn't sound quite the same. So I'm just gonna take that off and just pretend that I didn't do it. Well, here we go. Now we gotta rank these things. Okay. After some consideration, I think this is where the list falls. For me personally, for the 10 best, most representative Dreamcast games for that delightful console that I love so much. I'll go through this real quick. Skies of Arcadia is Sega's best role-playing game. It has the best characters, it has some of the best music, it has some of the best exploration, it has really good combat in both ship and in-person battles, even if the random encounter is tuned way too high. There is a quote-unquote better port on the GameCube that adds content, but I feel like there's some things that are a little lacking in that version. I think the Dreamcast version looks a tad bit nicer and sounds a little better because the music got compressed as hell to get on the GameCube disc. But there is no question that Skies of Arcadia is Sega's best game, in my opinion, and the best game on the Dreamcast. It's the only game that I currently own in 3 versions. I have the Dreamcast North American version, I have the GameCube Japanese version, and the GameCube North American version, and I would buy the Dreamcast Japanese version, and I've thought about it. It's in my top 10. There's no way I could pick anything else to represent the Dreamcast than Skies of Arcadia. Marvel vs. Capcom 2. New Age of Heroes. The Dreamcast version has been the gold standard for that game for such a long time. That's really what people know in terms of tournament play. In fact, the recent Marvel vs. Capcom collection, since it's based on the arcade version, is kind of throwing some people off a little bit because it does things ever so slightly different. But for me personally, I remember when I was in high school that I would spend time in my multimedia class where I had access to a computer with internet, because I did not have a computer with internet in high school at home, looking up information about Marvel vs. Capcom 2 and taking screen caps, putting it on a floppy disk, bringing the news home so I could work on a newsletter that I never sent to anybody, but that's just how excited I was about Marvel 2. And I remember the day I picked up the game from Sam Goody, when those existed, that I went into the Namco arcade in the same mall, and Marvel vs. Capcom 2 was there. And I picked a team of Sakura and Ken and Gambit, probably. I don't quite remember what it was, but and I won a few matches, and it was fun. This was before anyone knew anything about the meta of Marvel vs. Capcom 2 and how critical assists were to the overall flow of that game. But yeah, I think I won 6 matches before somebody who had more time and experience with the game got on there and just absolutely wiped the floor with me. And then I went and bought the Dreamcast version and brought it home and had countless hours of joy playing it with friends. And doing pretty well without using assists. One thing that I'm looking forward to when the physical Marvel vs. Capcom collection launches in November is actually learning how that works, is actually doing what the game wants you to do and use assists. So, that is why it's number 2. Is that legacy. Soul Calibur, though, honestly could be higher on this list if I wasn't putting my own sphere of influence onto it. Soul Calibur is the defining port of the Dreamcast. There is no other game that is better as a port than Soul Calibur. It outclassed the arcade version significantly. Visually, it is still one of the most breathtaking games to look at. even with 5 sequels that came out after it, I still think Soul Calibur 1 is one of the best looking video games ever made. Namco went all in, and they delivered what could be considered the premier fighting experience in 3D on the Dreamcast. It made Virtua Fighter 3 TB ashamed. To the point that Sega didn't really bother releasing any other of their 3D fighting games on the North American Dreamcast. We didn't get Fighting Vipers 2. We didn't get Spike Out, which is more of a beat 'em up, but the point remains. So Namco just set the bar so high with Soul Calibur that it's still like one of the greatest games ever made to me. All the sequels have paled in comparison to the breadth of the content too. I love just the simple mission mode that they put in, and all of the really awesome artwork that you can unlock along the way, along with the hidden characters, a little bit of music, some stages. It was just a great addition to the arcade experience. Soul Calibur's great. Grandia 2. Boy, there was a lot of hype around Grandia 2. I think even at the time that Grandia 2 overshadowed Skies of Arcadia in terms of just hype factor. And in some ways, Grandia 2 is a better game than Skies. I think that in terms of the actual moment-to-moment combat engine, Grandia 2 is better, because I think that it has a really great free-flowing combat system where chains are really important, and you can break your opponent's moves with certain attacks, which is very important for priority. It's also visually stunning. It's also got a great soundtrack. Where it falls is story and characters. Skies of Arcadia has the best characters and a really good story. Grandia 2 is very boilerplate, and the characters are fine. And that is why Grandia 2 is just not as good as Skies, and why it's 4th versus higher up on the list. I think it's still one of the best Dreamcast games. I think it's better than everything below it. But I think that it's not as enjoyable on a emotional front for me as Skies is. And that's why it's 4th place versus higher. So 5th place is kind of tricky, because I have Code Veronica, and that's why it's above some of the others. I also think that it was a really important Dreamcast game to try to say, hey, we also have Resident Evil over here, and look at how nice it is. It's just visually above everything that we put out on the PS1. So give it a go, please. I don't think Code Veronica, in terms of the overall breadth of Resident Evil, is considered highly at this point. It has problems for sure, especially how it handles a potentially trans character. It's written in the 90s, so I think enough said there. But why Code Veronica, I think, is still one of my favorite games in the series, in some ways, is because of Claire. I think Claire is wonderful in Code Veronica, even though she gets tangled up in Steve, and they really try to force a romantic angle between them that should have been done, because it doesn't really fit Claire, in my opinion. Beyond that, I like her design a lot in this game. I like the fact that the game's primarily focused on her. Chris has a good chunk of time too, and it's the best Chris before they messed him up in 5 onward. I think it's the best version of Chris. It's the one that I like, and I don't like most of them, so I think Wesker getting a chance to shine is also great. I think Alexia Ashford is a very fascinating boss in terms of design and execution. There's some really good stuff in Code Veronica. It's just that, in contrast to a lot of the other games in the series, it made some mistakes. It falters a bit. I will say this. It has one of the best opening cutscenes of all the Resident Evil games. Claire running through an Umbrella lab with a helicopter, shooting a Gatling gun at her, and she's just running from it and just watching all the debris fly behind her. And then she jumps into a room, is stunned by several guards, drops her gun, lowers herself midway through to catch the gun and shoot oil tanks behind them. I love that scene. I think that scene is still one of my favorite cutscenes in any of the games in the series, arguably in games. I just think that really was a defining moment for Claire. And that's why I love Claire so much, beyond RE2. So yeah, I think for me personally, I think Code Veronica is in the top 5, even though it has quite a few faults. And then there's Sega Swirl, the game that I told you you'd be surprised why it's so high. And the reason is it's my favorite puzzle game of all time. It's so simple, and yet it's so good. I have spent way too many hours playing Sega Swirl, and I would love to play it again, but I don't know if it's available anywhere easily on modern PCs without emulating it, and I'm just not the biggest emulator. But I think Sega Swirl is just addictive and delightful and does all the things that I want to see in puzzle games. Drop down, toss up, those are fine, but I have a hard time getting engaged with them. There's just something about the Sega Swirl aesthetic with its simple shapes and pixely design, and the cute little snake that supports you as you go along, and how the shapes change into different degrees of breaking apart. Like when you get a bunch of them together, they're fireworks. It's just super charming game. The jazzy soundtrack works for it so well. I don't know why I love Sega Swirl so much as my favorite puzzle game, but it's a defining Sega Dreamcast game for me, and I adore it more than the rest of the games on the list. Sonic Adventure. I had this at launch, pretty close. When I got my Dreamcast, it came with the console somehow. I think I got it at Costco. So I started my career with the Dreamcast with Marvel vs. Capcom 1 and Sonic Adventure. And Soul Calibur was pretty close behind. So those were like the 3 games that I started with. I don't have Sonic Adventure 1 on the Dreamcast now. I think that Sonic Adventure is still the best 3D Sonic game after all this time and all the attempts that they've made. It's rough in some areas, but it's like Sega had their direction figured out, where they wanted to go with 3D Sonic after completely skipping the Saturn. They ran with this idea, and the unfortunate thing is then they continued running it so hard into the ground that it really lost what made it special. But I think Sonic Adventure 1, especially Sonic's levels, really capture what Sonic in 3D should be, even though it's glitchy, even though you can easily run off the side. Your hover attack can mess you up. It just captures that essence, and it doesn't overdo the characters in terms of their conversations. Since the 2D games really relied on just silent storytelling, this was the first game that really had them talk a lot. And I think it worked okay here. That's one of the issues that I have with the later ones, is that they just get too up their own ego in terms of trying to create grandiose plot with Sonic, when really it's just the moment-to-moment running around that I think is what's really good. And Sonic Adventure has that. I think the stages are good. The spin-off modes are novel in this game. They don't feel too much like padding, and it has a great soundtrack, really defining what the butt rock Sonic sound is going to be moving forward. But it's good. I like this soundtrack a lot. And I think it's better than Sonic Adventure 2. I think Sonic Adventure 2 is where it starts to go off the rails, which is funny because that's where they introduced the rails to grind on. And overall, I just don't like it as much. So, Sonic Adventure, I think it's a defining Dreamcast game. I went with the original Power Stone over Power Stone 2 because I feel like the gameplay in Power Stone 1 is better. And I like the stages more in Power Stone 1 than in 2. 2 is probably the better game. But for me, Power Stone 1 was a very important early Dreamcast game. Showed that Capcom can do 3D fighters too, after some stumbles with Star Gladiator. I think that this was a very good attempt to try to make a Smash-esque fighter, which I think Power Stone 2 took to the next level. But this also just feels like a Capcom fighting game and not a brawler like Power Stone 2 does. And just the aesthetics of this game I think are stronger than 2. So that's why 2 didn't make the cut. Probably be number 11, honestly, if I'm just going to be honest. Because I think Power Stone 2 is a Dreamcast game, unlike a couple of the ones that I cut. But it's a good fighting game, and I'm looking forward to playing it next year on the Fighting Collection 2. Crazy Taxi is a very important arcade port for Sega. One of the best ones that they personally did, and they had tons of them. The biggest fault it has is content, in that there's only the main map and a few missions, and that's about it for a full-priced game. And if you are really into the arcade vibes that Crazy Taxi has, you will be in heaven. I got a little bit bored, so that's why I don't have it anymore. But I still think that this game defines the Dreamcast. I still love the soundtrack to this game, the 4 songs that were on it. I think that it's just a really well-executed port of a really fantastic arcade game. If you resonate with its vibes, you're gonna have a wonderful time. And then there's a sequel too, if you get really into it, so you can drive around, I think, New York instead of San Francisco. I think that was where 2 was set. I don't quite remember. And last but not least is Jet Grind Radio, a game that is so based on vibes that you can overlook some of its gameplay faults. Visually, very stunning. One of the games that really pioneered the cell shading look that we see a lot in the years to follow. Super, super, super soundtrack aesthetic. Really defines the vibe. And then Sega of America messed it up by adding a bunch of American songs to it. So you get Dragula out of nowhere in between your Magical Girl and your Super Brothers from Guitar Vader, which this is what introduced me to Guitar Vader, and I love them. Great character designs. The concept of it is excellent. It's really just the gameplay moment to moment that falters a bit because you have to do QTEs to do the spray painting, and it's a little bit touchy on doing the skating. And once you actually start getting deep in police involvement, it gets kind of annoying having to run all the time. But it's still a very defining Dreamcast game, and it's a series that I hope Sega can bring back with their initiative to resurrect some of their franchises with AAA degree budgets. I'm hopeful that they can get Jet Grind Radio, or as it should be called, Jet Set Radio, back on track with a fantastic new entry that I think would really finally bring together the really awesome visual and oral aesthetic with gameplay that matches. There you have it. 10 best Dreamcast games that I feel truly represent the console, as well as my own tastes. I hope you enjoyed that look at one of my favorite systems. And it's nice to see some of it is coming out on modern platforms. I'm really excited about Capcom Fighting Collection 2, bringing back Project Justice and the Power Stones, and Street Fighter Alpha 3 Upper, the one that I actually know, and Plasma Sword. It's great to see all of those games come back, and there's some others that I would really like to see come back too. Worms Armageddon's also coming back, which I think is great. Skies of Arcadia. Please, Sega, just bring that game back. I guess I need to record another one of those episodes in the future. But we're going to take a break for October from this show unless there's a Reacts reason, like a Switch 2 announcement finally happens or something. Then we'll have all Levels Plus whatever in between all the horror and Halloween-y vibe content and Levels Plus plays. So, thank you for joining me. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you in another video sometime. Take care.